Africa, where the human race began. Nearly 1 billion people live here. And it's a continent with an incredible diversity of communities and cultures. Yet we know less of its history than almost anywhere else on Earth. But that's beginning to change. In the last few decades, researchers and archaeologists have begun to uncover a range of histories as impressive and extraordinary as anywhere else on Earth. It's a history which has been neglected for years, and it's largely without written records. But it is preserved for us in the gold and statues, in the culture, art, and legends of the people. My name is Gus Casely Hayford. Over many years, I've studied the history and culture of Africa. As an art historian, I'm used to drawing stories from mute objects from the past. I'm going to discover the history and find out what really happened to the lost kingdoms of Africa. Many of the stories of Africa are told here, the British Museum in London. This is where thousands of artifacts, collected, bought, and taken from the continent, ended up. When they were first discovered, objects from the ancient kingdoms of West Africa stunned the world. None more so than these extraordinary plaques. They came from what was once the Kingdom of Benin and are around 500 years old. When the British came upon these objects in 1897, they thought there's no way they could have been created by Africans. They were amazed at the detail and the intricacy. They were seen as being something completely revolutionary to the British, and you can understand why. These aren't carvings. They're 16th century casts in copper-rich alloys of brass and bronze. Over 900 plaques are thought to have been made. To produce each one, the artist would need to know how to make and fire a clay mold, and how to melt the metals to pour into it. It's an incredibly difficult skill to master. The combination of relatively sophisticated science and artistic accomplishment baffled most European 19th century observers. They couldn't believe that so-called primitives had been capable of producing work of the same standard as their European contemporaries. These amazing objects just didn't match the Europeans' view of West Africans. The questions were, where did they get the technology to develop this amazing bronze work, and where did they find the materials? But the clues to how such artifacts were manufactured are there for the finding, and I think they will reveal much about the West African kingdoms that created them. I want to know why they were made, what they mean, and what that tells us about the time and place they were produced. And there are some symbols that seem to reoccur: the leopard, the snake, the crocodile, so obviously they were very important. I want to find out what they mean and why they were so important to these people. These recurring images remind me of the symbolic motifs in Renaissance art. I think they carry hidden layers of meaning beyond the understanding of the imperialistic Brits. So what do the bronzes tell us about the Kingdom of Benin and its power and its culture? And what does the technology required to make them tell us about pre-colonial West Africa? I'll travel to modern-day Nigeria, where the Kingdom of Benin reached its height in the 16th century. And I'll reach even further back in time and explore a panoply of ancient cities and kingdoms in West Africa, founded many centuries before Benin. I look for evidence in what's now Mali of how ancient culture and technologies made Benin and its bronzes possible. The centre of power of the Kingdom of Benin was Benin City. Today it's one of Nigeria's thriving cities, home to over 1 million Africans. The main circle in the centre is dotted with statues, public art depicting Benin's history. For 600 years, until the late 19th century, it dominated this part of West Africa. But the kingdom's former scale and power are not immediately obvious, unless you know where to look. Dr. Ekagusa Isian, author of several books on Benin's history, is taking me to see a 500-year-old feat of engineering. At the kingdom's height in the 16th century, a series of moats and earthen walls protected the city and its surrounding land.
It was a defensive system that consisted of a ditch and then a rampart.
What little survives is overgrown and barely recognizable. But archaeologists have found evidence of a vast network of trenches and walls up to 9 meters high. They zigzagged around the city area for an incredible 4,000 miles.
Benin really was the capital of this part of Africa. That is the eastern part of the west coast of Africa. Benin was the principal town. It was an important center of the culture of this part of Africa. It was an important center of the political reach along this huge area of the eastern portion of the west coast of Africa.
The kingdom was governed from a vast palace by a hereditary ruler, the Oba. And his subjects were animists, believers in the idea that souls and spirits existed not only in humans, but in animals, plants, and the earth itself. At its height, it exerted political, military, and economic control over an area stretching almost 40,000 square miles. In the 19th century, the British saw the kingdom as an opportunity to extend their influence in Africa. They established a trade agreement, but when Benin reneged on it, relations deteriorated. A British delegation ignored warnings not to approach the Oba and were massacred, leaving just 2 survivors from over 200 people. A month later, in February 1897, 1,200 British soldiers arrived in response. The city walls didn't stop the British punitive expedition, and the city was razed to the ground. At the royal palace, they found artwork that they couldn't believe had been created by Africans. Around 2,000 pieces were taken, sold, and distributed to Western museums. The Oba was deposed and died in exile. It was a catastrophic defeat for the Kingdom of Benin, but that's not the impression you get from the modern monument in the center of the city. It shows a Benin warrior standing victorious over his dead and dying British enemies.
And I actually see it as a triumph of narrative, that we will continue as a nation, whatever. Ultimately, it tells the story of a victorious nation. Victorious in the sense that it proudly tells its stories, whether it's in the Benin bronzes or whether it's in monuments like this today.
In Benin, it seems history isn't written by the victors, it's written by the artists. And the Kingdom of Benin disappeared only for a short time. In 1914, the British restored the monarchy to Benin City to help administer their Nigerian colony, and a modest palace was rebuilt. The traditions of the kingdom that have survived are maintained from an enclave in the city centre. I've been granted a royal audience, an opportunity to attend the Oba's court, where hereditary and appointed chiefs gather each day. When His Royal Majesty the Oba of Benin enters, the chiefs greet him with "God save the King." This is more than a symbolic institution. The Oba and his chiefs rule on issues brought to them by ordinary people. Their judgment carries authority here, and the kingdom exists in parallel with the Nigerian state. With a leopard at the Oba's feet and standard bearers at his side, it's like one of the Benin bronzes come to life. This is the kind of occasion he believes the plaques were designed to mark.
Those bronzes were not made for museum pieces. Initially, in the absence of photography and writing, they were made to depict, illustrate events in the palace or in the community or some festivals. That's why you see them. They were made as in the absence of photography. That's what they were meant for initially. Yes.
And how important are the bronze casters, the smiths, the people who actually make these objects?
They are a guild of a royal guild, specifically to be doing this thing in the olden days.
The Bronze Casters Guild exists today. Their main business is tourist souvenirs, but the makers are still an exclusive group of craftsmen with high social status. Membership of the Royal Guild is hereditary. Ikpongwusa Ine's family have been bronze casters for as long as anyone can remember. And the skills that created the 16th century bronzes are still evident today.
It's liquid, it's now liquid now. You can see the flame. Inside.
The process begins with a simple clay shape to act as a core.
So then you cover the core with wax?
With wax. Then you start your details. The mouth, the nose, the eye.
And then you cover it
with the mud.
With the mud?
This is the soft mud which we use in covering them. So you cover the whole with the mud, soft mud, after the designing.
The details in the wax will leave their impression on the clay mud. When the object is heated, the clay will harden and the wax will melt and drain out. Molten metal will fill the space left by the wax.
Inside the fire is like this pot, and with this scrap metal, yes, you load this pot.
In the 16th century, the craftsmen melted down copper bracelets brought by Portuguese traders to create brass and bronze. Nowadays, any metal seems to do.
So you could put something like a car aerial?
It's scrap metal.
Yeah.
Then you put them in here. Then I put it inside the fire here.
In the furnace, the assortment of metal melts at around 1,000 degrees Celsius.
So you don't waste anything?
Ikpong Musa has some molds that have been fired, and the melted wax has been drained away. Now the molten metal can be poured in.
It's just amazing to think that these processes haven't changed for hundreds of years.
No, it doesn't change.
But the thing is, it still feels totally relevant as well.
Very. The same way in 100 years ago, the same way today. The same processes from one stage to another, from one stage to another, is the same process.
And in terms of the relevance, is it still there? Do people still feel these are important?
Very. We have more than 100 and something members of bronze casters along the streets.
Really?
Walking.
And they still feel...
And the junior ones are still coming up.
Really? And they feel connected to the Oba and the Royal Palace?
Yes.
So those old stories and traditions, they're as important to you as they ever were to your ancestors?
It remains this year, next year, and forever.
Forevermore?
Yeah.
Once the mold is cooled enough, it can be chipped away to leave the metal cast. It strikes me that Ikpongwusa and his fellow bronze casters have an impressive range of skills. They need to understand pottery, metallurgy, and have artistic ability. And the same skills would have been required 500 years ago to cast the Benin bronzes, something the Victorians could hardly believe.
Oh, I'm beginning to see what it is now. It's hands praying.
It's a prayer hand.
I see.
It's a prayer hand.
A Christian ornament which has been created using a centuries-old technique. For me, these objects don't reach the standards of the 16th century bronzes. But these are for the tourist rather than for the royal palace. Reminders of the quality craftsmanship once commissioned by the king now lie in Benin City Museum. These are, sadly, mostly replicas of bronzes that were taken from here in 1897. But even so, I'm struck once again by the intricacy of these objects.
It's always the detail that shocks me when I look at these Benin plaques. I mean, the whole thing is very much like a historical document as much as a piece of art. I mean, this is depicting very particular people, and you can imagine them in all of their finery, because you can see it actually depicted here, the detail of the textiles, the layered textiles that they're wearing.
Many bronzes depict 16th century obas, and they are records of specific events, such as military victories which expanded the kingdom.
This, for me, will be Oba Essegy returning from fighting the Agana triumphant with his retinue.
Oba Essegy bolstered the kingdom with the help of the Portuguese, who provided weapons and mercenaries for battles. Many of the plaques were made during his reign. The Portuguese also brought the metal, which enabled the bronze casters to immortalize his exploits. But this craft predates the arrival of the Portuguese, so there must have been another source of copper for the bronzesmiths. And while the bronzes were records of the kingdom's histories, I think they were also more than that. I want to find the origin and meaning of the symbols depicted in them, like this magnificent leopard and the snake which appears on the roof of the Oba's palace. I also want to find out how the culture and technology spread. The answer may lie in West Africa's dynamic and lost civilizations. For 1,000 years before the rise of Benin, West Africa had seen several overlapping kingdoms rise and fall. They had no fixed boundaries or singular ethnic identity. They were held together by the trade routes they sought to control. The 14th century saw one kingdom in particular flourish, the Empire of Mali and its city, Timbuktu. I'm going there to see whether there's any evidence that points to the development of Benin craftsmanship 500 years ago. In the 1300s, Mali was the most powerful kingdom in West Africa. Its emperor, Mansa Musa, was at one time thought to be the richest man in the world, famed for his vast gold reserves and for sending envoys to European courts. Timbuktu's wealth and power came because it was the hub of the lucrative trans-Sahara trade routes. Arab merchants brought goods such as salt, textiles and new metals into West Africa from across the desert. Metals are still worked in Timbuktu's back streets.
Very interesting.
I'm told that in the 14th century the camel trains brought refined copper from North Africa, which made its way south towards Benin. But if this was the source of the bronze caster's metal, I wonder if there are any other hints as to the meaning of the symbols I saw in the plaques. The Arabs didn't just bring goods to this part of Africa, they also brought Islam. It's certainly very different from Benin. I brought a local historian some images of the bronzes.
I have here some images of Benin plaques which are actually in the British Museum. I'm just wondering if, looking at these images, if they played any part in the history or the mythologies of Timbuktu.
Vers le nord, c'est très difficile de trouver les bronzes et autres parce que l'islam interdit de faire les objets à visage humain. De telle sorte que chez nous, c'est le dessin géométrique, c'est la calligraphie, c'est les poteries. Vous savez que en ce temps en Afrique, c'est l'islam qui a introduit l'écriture. Et quel que soit, on ne peut pas échanger avec les images, avec les sculptures.
Timbuktu's storytelling is owned by teachers and scholars from the libraries and the ancient university, not by guilds of craftsmen. Timbuktu may have been the source of copper for the bronze work further south, but not the imagery, the techniques, or symbolism I've seen. But further south is another important ancient city of West Africa. 220 miles from Timbuktu is the city of Djenné. Perhaps I can find clues there as to how the culture and craftsmanship of Benin may have developed. It lies on a natural thoroughfare, the inland delta of the River Niger. Djenné was established here around 800 AD, 3 centuries before Timbuktu, and 800 years before the Benin bronzes were cast.
This is Djenné. It's one of the great markets of West Africa. And when the market's on, the town here swells to more than 3 times its usual size. This is one of the great spectacles of West Africa.
I've arranged to meet a local historian and guide, Amadou Cissé.
Hello,
good to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
Thank
Welcome
you.
to Djenné.
Djenné was flourishing by the 13th century, and there has been a thriving market here ever since, overlooked by the great mosque that dominates the city. But it isn't just a local market. Djenné has long been connected with far-flung destinations, and the proof is on the market stalls themselves.
These are beautiful beads.
Yeah, those are the old beads.
These are old. Because I know that there are beads that have been found here that
Yes.
are more than 2,000 years old.
Of course.
That may have come from India or China.
Of course. So they found one bead, one, another, and they put it together and make them necklace.
At its peak, it was without doubt one of the great markets of West Africa. I mean, the trade from here supported the development not just of the mosque, but of a huge infrastructure across the area. And it drew people from miles around.
Its strategic position as a trading crossroads meant Djenné was contested and conquered by several kingdoms throughout its long history. Yet Djenné has managed to hold on to particularly local traditions. These mud buildings are unlike anything else in West Africa.
I mean, this is a beautiful house.
The architecture of Djenné is unique in the world.
Amadou says that each architectural feature has meaning. The vertical columns indicate that the owner had 2 wives. There's one pillar at the top for each of his 5 children. This symbolism has more in common with the craftsmanship of Benin, nearly 900 miles away, than to the writing traditions of Timbuktu to the north.
So that was in between the 12th to the 13th century. People are doing a building house on that type of architecture.
Yeah.
Islam forbids representative images, but could this architecture be an outlet for artists here? Every house tells a visual story.
It's a mud building. We have to rebuild our house every year. When there is, for example, because it's a mud building, in the rain season we lose a part of the wall. When there is some a new birth in our family or somebody died, we change the whole architecture every year.
And so that must mean that there is a whole tradition of masons